Every now and then, someone becomes so convinced they're right that they build an entire experiment just to prove it. In 1973, one anthropologist did exactly that. His name was Santiago Genovese, and his experiment would become one of the strangest ever attempted. He recruited 11 strangers from different countries, different cultures, different religions, different personalities, placed them together on a tiny wooden raft, pushed them into the Atlantic Ocean, and waited for human nature to reveal itself. He believed that if people had nowhere to hide, nowhere to escape, and almost no privacy, conflict wouldn't just happen, it would be inevitable. There was only one problem. Reality had other plans. For decades, newspapers remembered this voyage by a nickname that sounded almost too ridiculous to be true, the sex raft. It's certainly memorable, but it's also a little unfair. Because if that's all you know about the Acali experiment, then you've only heard the headline, not the story. The real story is about expectations. As a teenager, he had lived through the Spanish Civil War. He had seen what violence could do to ordinary lives. Years later, after becoming an anthropologist in Mexico, that experience still lingered in the back of his mind. What turns neighbors into enemies? Is violence something we're born with or something our circumstances bring out of us? His approach to investigation was surprisingly methodical. Take a group of people who had almost nothing in common and place them in complete isolation. Remove almost every opportunity for privacy, then simply watch. Even today, it feels less like a scientific study and more like the world's most ambitious group project. Every participant knew they were joining an unusual expedition, but none of them, not even Santiago himself, could have predicted what the next 101 days were about to reveal. Because here's the funny thing about experiments. You can control the conditions. You can prepare for every possibility. You can fill notebooks with predictions. But the moment real people enter the picture, the experiment stops belonging entirely to you. And that's exactly what happened. Because once the ropes were untied and the shoreline began shrinking into the distance, the Atlantic stopped caring about hypotheses. It simply introduced 11 strangers to each other. The raft itself wasn't an accident. Neither were the people aboard it. Every decision Santiago made served the same purpose: create an environment where human nature had nowhere to hide. The vessel was named Acali, after an Aztec word for a watercraft. It wasn't designed to be comfortable. It wasn't supposed to be. Comfort has a funny habit of hiding people's rough edges. Santiago wanted to know what happened after those edges were exposed. The journey would begin in the Canary Islands and end, if everything went according to plan, more than 5,000 kilometers away in Mexico. Roughly 101 days at sea, no hotels, no weekends, no going home early because the project wasn't what you expected. Once the shoreline disappeared, so did the exit. But the raft was only half the experiment. The real experiment was the crew and the difference in members, nationalities, religions, political views, and personalities. The more potential for misunderstanding, the better for Santiago. Instead of filling the raft with mostly men, as was common on ocean voyages at the time, he chose 6 women and 5 men. Some of them were sailors, some weren't. Some had scientific backgrounds, others were simply curious enough to say yes to an opportunity that sounded somewhere between an expedition and an incredibly specific bad idea. Looking back, it's hard not to admire that level of optimism, or question it, possibly both. They came from different corners of the world. Many spoke different first languages. Some had completely different ideas about politics, religion, family, and the way people ought to live. On land, they might never have met. On Acali, they would wake up beside each other every morning for the next 3 months. Moreover, there was one small detail that almost every description of the raft mentions: the bathroom, or at least what generously qualified as one. It had a tiny wooden door. By most accounts, the door was specifically designed so that anyone outside could see your feet underneath it, if nothing else, which meant privacy wasn't exactly one of Acali's strongest features. If you've ever lived with roommates, congratulations, you still had more privacy than the crew of Acali. It's a funny detail, but it also mattered. Because privacy isn't just about comfort, it's where we go to cool down, to think, to be alone with our frustrations. On Acali, those moments were almost impossible to find. If someone annoyed you, you couldn't disappear into another room. There wasn't another room. There wasn't another floor. And despite what your HR department might recommend after a disagreement, taking a calming walk wasn't really an option either. The Atlantic Ocean isn't particularly pedestrian friendly. Everything was ready. The notebooks, the supplies, the route, the crew, even the predictions. Santiago believed he had thought of almost everything. Almost. Because there was one variable no scientist has ever been able to fully calculate: what happens when real people refuse to behave like theories. The answer would begin the moment Acali slipped away from the dock and the land slowly faded behind the horizon. The first few days felt exactly the way Santiago had imagined. Everyone was polite, a little cautious, still learning names, still trying to figure out where they fit into this tiny floating world. Like the first day at a new job, except your office happened to be drifting across the Atlantic. Soon, the routine settled in. Mornings began with the same faces, the same horizon, the same handful of daily chores: cooking, cleaning, adjusting the sails, checking supplies, and every now and then waiting patiently outside what may have been the least convincing bathroom door ever built. If that little door had one job, history suggests it may have been slightly underqualified. The strange thing about routines is that they quietly change people. At first, everyone notices the differences: different accents, different habits, different beliefs, different ways of doing even the simplest tasks. But after enough shared mornings, those differences slowly become familiar, not obstacles, just a part of the day. Santiago noticed everything, or at least he tried to. The notebook was never far away. Someone laughed, he wrote. Someone looked frustrated, he wrote. Someone spent a little longer talking to another crew member than usual. He definitely wrote. From time to time, people got irritated. Someone forgot a task. Someone worked harder than someone else. Someone probably told the same story for the fifth time. Life, in other words. But those little sparks rarely turned into the wildfire Santiago had expected. Instead, they usually ended the same way. Someone listened, someone apologized, someone cracked a joke, and life moved on. It turns out when 11 people know they'll still be eating dinner together in a few hours, winning every argument suddenly feels a lot less important. The newspapers would eventually become fascinated by the romantic relationships that developed aboard Acali. And yes, they existed. That much is true. After all, if you place 11 people together for more than 3 months without privacy, without distractions, and with a bathroom door that treated confidentiality as more of a suggestion than a rule, it's perhaps not the most shocking outcome in human history. But reducing the voyage to romance misses something much more interesting. The real story wasn't who kissed whom. It was how strangers slowly learned to live together. Friendships formed. People covered each other's chores, shared stories from home, laughed at the same jokes, comforted one another after difficult days. Without realizing it, they stopped acting like passengers. They started acting like a family team. Everything was looking absolutely opposite to Santiago's expectations. The experiment wasn't producing the kind of conflict he'd spent years preparing to study. If anything, the people seemed to be getting better at living together, not worse. So he leaned in. He observed more closely, asked more questions, sometimes uncomfortable ones. He adjusted small aspects of life aboard the Raft, hoping to better understand the group's dynamics. From his perspective, he was doing exactly what a researcher does. From the crew's perspective, the notebook was beginning to feel less like a notebook and more like a cursed item on board. Some crew members later reflected that the greatest source of tension on Acali was that constant awareness that almost everything happens will then become another observation in Santiago's notebook. It's one of history's gentlest ironies. The man who had crossed an ocean, hoping to study the conflict, was slowly becoming part of the environment everyone else had to adapt to. And somehow, they adapted remarkably well. By the final weeks of the voyage, something remarkable had happened. Not because life aboard Acali had become easy. It hadn't. The ocean was still the ocean. The raft was still tiny. The bathroom door still seemed to believe privacy was more of a philosophical concept than a physical one. But the people had changed. The strangers who had climbed aboard weeks earlier had quietly become something else. Not a perfect family, not lifelong best friends, simply a community. The kind that only forms when people stop trying to win every disagreement and start figuring out how to live with one another instead. Arguments still happened. Of course they did. No honest story about 11 people living together for 101 days could claim otherwise. But the disaster Santiago had expected never truly arrived, not because people stopped being human, but because they kept being human. They laughed, they apologized, they adapted, they found small ways to make life easier for one another. And day by day, the experiment drifted further away from its original prediction. Several participants would later recall that the greatest source of tension was the experiment itself, not the differences between the volunteers. Santiago was not a villain. Far from it. He was doing what he believed good science required, observing, questioning, recording, trying to understand. But reality had begun asking questions of its own. There's an image I can't get out of my head. As the voyage neared its end, many accounts describe Santiago becoming quieter, while the people around him shared meals, worked together, laughed, sometimes found unexpected companionship. He often sat apart with his notebooks. It's difficult to know exactly what he was thinking. Maybe he was reviewing his observations. Maybe he was already trying to make sense of what he'd witnessed. Or maybe he was simply tired after more than 3 months at sea. Whatever the reason, there's something deeply human about that picture. A scientist searching for one answer and discovering something far more complicated. When Acali finally reached its destination, the experiment was over. The notebooks were full. The newspapers, however, had their own priorities. Many focused almost entirely on the romantic relationships aboard the raft, the sex raft. It was a headline people remembered, because headlines often survive longer than the stories beneath them. But what actually happened out there is far more interesting than the nickname. Santiago set sail hoping to discover why strangers become enemies. Instead, he documented something much quieter: how strangers become neighbors. Not instantly, not effortlessly, not without awkward moments or disagreements, but slowly. One shared meal, one conversation, one ordinary day at a time. Maybe that's why the Acali experiment still feels surprisingly modern. We spend so much of our lives convinced that our differences must eventually pull us apart. And Acali didn't prove those differences don't matter. They do. But it suggested something equally important. Living together doesn't automatically create division. Sometimes it creates understanding. And perhaps that's the experiment's greatest legacy. Not in that Santiago proved his theory or not. Science is rarely that simple. His greatest achievement may have been asking a question bold enough that reality answered in its own words. So the next time you hear someone mention the sex raft, remember that you're hearing the headline, not the story. Because hidden beneath that nickname is a tiny wooden raft floating across an endless Atlantic where 11 strangers accidentally demonstrated something their own experiment was never designed to measure. That cooperation can be just as natural for humans as conflict. Interesting, isn't it? Santiago crossed an ocean searching for the proofs to his theories based on the most terrible wars took place in 20th century. And instead, he gave us one of history's quietest and inspiring reminder that human beings are often far better at surprising us than any theory ever could be.